The room went silent when the old Don shattered the glass. It went colder when the waitress spoke, but it turned deadly when she revealed her real name. In less than one night, Elena went from invisible server to the daughter of a murdered Mafia insider, the keeper of a hidden recording, and the woman who would force 5 crime families to hear the truth in public. This story starts with bread on a table and ends with an empire collapsing in front of everyone.
Feels. The old man's hand moved before anyone in the room could understand what they were seeing. 1 second, the wineglass was full. The next second, it exploded against the marble floor, red wine running like blood between the legs of polished chairs. Feels. The waiter who had poured it with the wrong hand was slammed against the wall by a grip that should not have belonged to an 80-year-old man. Nobody inside the gilded obsidian moved. Not the manager, not the bodyguards. Feels. Not the hedge fund men who suddenly found their desserts fascinating. Not the women draped in diamonds who had spent the evening pretending they were not in a restaurant built for people who still solved problems in older ways. Feels. The room froze because everyone knew the same thing. Men like Don Salvatore Moretti did not get angry in public unless the night was about to become unforgettable. And then, from the shadow near the service station, Feels, came the one person nobody in that room had really seen. Elena Rossi, 23. Feels, waitress. Oversized uniform, flat shoes, head slightly down. The kind of young woman rich people forgot the moment she set down a plate. She stepped forward with a basket of bread in one hand and a small ceramic dish in the other. Not fancy bread. Feels. Not the expensive truffle oil the restaurant bragged about. Staff bread, real bread, dense crust, honest olive oil. The bodyguard near the platform moved to stop her. Elena tilted her head and said quietly, "For the Don." The guard studied her face, Feels, decided she was either harmless or too calm to be ordinary, and stepped aside. Elena reached the table. The old man was still standing, chest rising hard with anger, one hand on his cane. Lorenzo Moretti, his son, had gone still beside him, Feels, watching everything with the cool attention of a man who had learned early that survival begins with observation. Feels. Elena set the bread in front of Salvatore like an offering, poured the oil, adjusted the glass an inch to the right, then folded her hands over her apron and spoke in a dialect that had not been heard in rooms like this for decades. Vucenza benedica, Feels, Don Turi, upania karu, mancia scordalira. Bless me, Don Turi. The bread is warm. Eat and forget your anger. The reaction was instant. Salvatore's fury did not shrink, it vanished. His face changed first, then his shoulders, then his eyes. Feels. The whole room felt it. The shift. The impossible. Lorenzo went rigid. He had heard that dialect once in his life, as a child, through a half-closed door, from men who did not use that language around outsiders. Feels. Salvatore lowered himself back into his chair like someone sitting in church after hearing the dead speak. "Where?" he asked, and his voice no longer sounded like weather or power or threat. It sounded like grief. "Where did you learn that?" Feels. Elena looked at him and did not look away. Feels. "My grandmother taught me," she said. "She said it was the only way to speak to God, and to men who think they are God." That line might have gotten her fired anywhere else. In that room, it made Lorenzo's mouth almost curve. Almost. Feels. Salvatore stared at her as if trying to see through the years. "Your grandmother. What was her name?" Elena hesitated for one breath. She had spent years learning how to survive by becoming small, but some moments do not let you stay small. Feels. "Grazia Vitali," she said. The name hit that table harder than the shattered glass had hit the marble. Salvatore gripped the edge of the cloth. The color drained from his face. "Grazia," he whispered. "The baker's daughter." Feels. He said it like someone remembering sunlight after a war. Elena nodded. She did not disappear in 1974. She ran. She came to Brooklyn. She baked bread for 30 years. She died 3 years ago. Feels. Salvatore reached for the basket and broke the bread from the side, not the middle, the old way. Feels. He dipped it in oil and closed his eyes when he tasted it. "It tastes like home," he said, and there was something terrible in hearing a dangerous old man sound suddenly human. That was the first shift of the night. The room saw a waitress. Feels. Then it saw a key turned in a locked door. Arthur, the manager, looked like he was being slowly strangled by his own tie. He understood none of this, but he understood hierarchy, and hierarchy had just flipped in front of him. Feels. Salvatore pointed toward Elena and said, "Tonight she does not serve. Tonight she eats with us." Arthur tried to protest. Lorenzo stopped him with one glance. Feels. Elena stood there with her breath trapped high in her chest because she understood what had just happened. In a room where status was everything, she had been invited to the center. And once you step into the center, feels, you do not get to go back to the edges and pretend nothing changed. Feels. She sat between father and son while the restaurant silently rearranged its understanding of the world. Salvatore asked her about old harvest songs, rosemary and bread crust, the women who dried tomatoes on stones above the valley in summer. Feels. Elena answered carefully. She had not spoken this much in years. She had spent too much of her life being careful with knowledge, careful with names, careful with the kind of truth that could get people killed. But the strange thing was this, feels. The more she spoke, the less afraid she became. Because fear thrives in silence. Respect does not. Respect needs light. Lorenzo barely touched his food. He watched. He listened. He noticed what his father missed in his emotion. Feels. Elena knew not just the dialect, but the formal mode, the coded phrases, the old table customs, the exact placement of bread and glass. A baker's daughter teaches prayers, he said finally, swirling his wine. Feels. She does not teach recognition codes from the inner circle. Feels. Elena met his eyes. Maybe my grandmother taught more than baking. Lorenzo almost smiled again, but this time there was no warmth in it. She did. He leaned closer, and I want to know why. Before Elena could answer, feels, the front doors burst open with the kind of force that was less an entrance than an insult. 6 men came in wearing leather and arrogance. At the center stood Dmitry Vulov, broad-shouldered, loud, feels, grinning the way men grin when they believe the room belongs to them. He saw the Moretti table. He saw Salvatore. Then he saw Elena. Don Salvatore, he called out, back in town, and dining with the help. The word landed like spit. Lorenzo stood, feels. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. You are interrupting my father's meal, he said. That is already unhealthy for you. Vulov laughed and walked closer, his men spreading like oil behind him. Then he made his mistake. Feels. He reached toward Elena's hair as if testing the room, testing Lorenzo, testing the old man, testing the human worth of a woman he had decided was decorative. Lorenzo caught his wrist so fast the sound of bone under pressure was audible in the silence. Feels. Touch her, Lorenzo said softly, and you lose the hand, then the arm, then the rest. Salvatore rose slowly, black-eyed and cold again. She is not staff, he said. She is a guest at my table. Sicilian blood, Corleone blood, feels. Elena heard the proverb before she knew she would say it. It came out low. He who disturbs bread dies hungry. Salvatore looked at her with something like wonder. Then he turned back to Vulov and smiled the coldest smile in the room. Exactly, feels. Vulov withdrew because he was outnumbered and because bad men are not brave. They are calculating. He looked at Elena once more on the way out. You picked the wrong side, he told her. That was the second shift of the night. Not just revelation, exposure. Feels. Now somebody dangerous had her face, her voice, and a reason to remember both. When the doors closed, Lorenzo sat back down and asked the question that mattered. Who are you? Elena did not answer immediately. She looked at Salvatore first. Feels. The old man had stopped trying to conceal the hope in his face. That made it worse somehow. Hope is a demand when it comes from the grieving. My grandmother raised me, Elena said, after my father was killed. Feels. Salvatore's fingers tightened on the tablecloth. Your father's name? Elena drew one breath and stepped through the last doorway. Santino Vitale, she said, though you knew him by another name, the ghost. Salvatore dropped his fork. Feels. The silver hit china and rang like a bell. Lorenzo's expression did not change much, but something sharpened behind it. Salvatore looked as if someone had reached into his chest and reopened a wound that had scarred badly and never healed clean. Santino, feels, he said, my friend, feels. Lorenzo said what his father could not. The man everyone believed betrayed us in 1985. Elena shook her head. He did not betray you. He died protecting your secrets. The room changed for the third time. A waiter could become a guest, feels. A ghost could become a father. A traitor could become a martyr. But this was the deepest shift. The story powerful men had used to survive for 20 years had just cracked down the middle. Feels. Elena sat with her hands folded while Salvatore stared at her as if truth had arrived too late to be merciful. My grandmother left me proof, she said. Before she died, she told me everything. My father kept records, deals, deliveries, meetings, deals. He knew someone inside the organization was feeding routes to the FBI. He knew that man planned to take the ports when the dust settled. He was gathering evidence when they killed him. They told me he took money and ran, Salvatore whispered. Feels. They told me he ran to Brazil. He never left New York, Elena said. Feels. He is buried in Queens under a false name. My grandmother paid every year to keep a safe deposit box alive on Wall Street. The key opens it. Lorenzo's asked the practical question. Where is the key? Elena lied. My apartment. It was not a complete lie. Eels. That is how people survive dangerous worlds. The night ended with the Morettis moving her out under guard because once a hidden person is seen by the wrong enemy, ordinary life ends before the person has time to grieve it. Eels. But Elena's story had begun long before that restaurant. It began with flour on her grandmother's hands, with silence used as shelter, with a child raised on lessons about dignity that sounded small until the day they saved her life. Eels. Grazia never taught Elena how to become powerful. She taught her how to remain human near power. There is a difference. Eels. And that difference is the line between someone who rules by fear and someone who can walk into a room of men with guns and still remember that bread should be broken from the side, because the center belongs to the table, not the hand. People think survival begins with force. Sometimes it begins with memory. Sometimes with a woman who spends 23 years learning how to disappear, only to discover that the world has been waiting for her real name all along. Eels. The convoy moved through Manhattan just after midnight, 3 black SUVs slipping across wet streets, while the city tried to pretend it was asleep. Elena sat in the back beside Lorenzo, still in the same uniform, heels, the fabric smelling faintly of olive oil and kitchen steam, her cheap plastic name tag pressed against her chest like a relic from a life that had ended a few hours earlier. Salvatore rode in the front with his cane across his knees, heels, looking out through the windshield with the stare of a man who had spent too many years living beside one lie because it hurt less than the truth. Nobody spoke for a long time. The silence in that car was not empty. It was crowded. Grief, suspicion, heels, calculation, curiosity. A fragile beginning of trust. Elena watched the streetlights move across the window and thought of her grandmother's kitchen in Brooklyn, where the table was scarred, the radiator was loud, heels, and truth was something spoken only after midnight. Grazia had never dramatized pain. Heels. She had never turned the past into theater. She would knead dough with those hard, flour-whitened hands and say things like, "People who are ignored hear everything," or "Never confuse expensive with valuable," heels, or "The world will teach you to respect status. I am teaching you to respect people." Elena had not understood how rare that was until she started working at the Gilded Obsidian. There, wealth turned ordinary men cruel in subtle ways. Heels. They snapped fingers at staff. They spoke about servers as if the servers were furniture with pulse. They made eye contact only when angry. Elena learned quickly that invisibility could protect you, heels, but it could also injure you if you believed what other people projected onto you. So she built a quiet life, school on pause, rent paid late but paid, savings folded into envelopes, a number in her head, enough to finish her degree, enough maybe, heels, to open a small bakery one day. Something simple, real bread, honest coffee, heels, a place where no one talked down to the person pouring water. That dream sounds small to people who confuse scale with meaning. It was not small to Elena. It was clean. It was decent. It belonged to her, heels. The SUV finally turned through iron gates into the Moretti estate, all stone and ocean wind and cameras that saw every angle. Inside, a woman named Maria took one look at Elena and understood immediately that this was no longer a hospitality matter, heels. It was family business, though nobody had said the word family out loud. Salvatore told Maria to get Elena clothes that fit and burn the uniform. Elena answered before she had time to weigh the risk. No. The word landed hard in the foyer. Heels. Renzo turned on the stairs and looked down at her with that same unreadable attention. "I keep it," she said, touching the name tag. "My grandmother wrote my name on the back the day I started at the restaurant. She said, 'Heels. No matter where you end up standing, remember the name I gave you. Heels.'" No one argued. It was a small victory, but real dignity often begins in small refusals. Much later, unable to sleep, I stepped out onto the balcony and found Lorenzo already there, with a glass of whiskey in his hand and the Atlantic in his eyes. Heels. Without the restaurant lights and the suit jacket and the roomful of men waiting for his decision, he looked still dangerous, but younger, more mortal. "You should be inside," he said. "Snipers. You're out here," Elena replied. "I'm harder to kill," Heels. It was the kind of answer arrogant men gave when they had survived too long. Elena leaned on the rail anyway. For a while they looked at the water and let the night speak between them. Then he asked, "What did you want before this, Heels?" It was an unexpectedly gentle question. I was saving money, she said. To go back to school, maybe open a bakery. He actually smiled at that, briefly. Of course. What's wrong with a bakery? Nothing. It's just. He paused. Feels. Your grandmother fled one world to bake bread. Your father built a wall of evidence to protect his child, and the child wants bread and ordinary mornings. That is either tragic or perfect. There are worse things to want. There are. Feels. Then the radio at his hip crackled. Marco, one of his men, reported movement at Elena's apartment in Queens. 2 vehicles, Vulov's plates. They had gone in 20 minutes earlier. Lorenzo's face changed as he listened. Feels. The more human version of him vanished, and the operational one returned. Contain, do not engage. We move at 5. He turned back to Elena. They're already at your place. She nodded. They won't find what they want. He studied her. Feels. You said the key was sewn into your winter coat. Elena bent, unlaced her left work shoe, pulled the heel apart, and took out a small silver key wrapped in wax paper. For 3 full seconds, Lorenzo just stared. Feels. Then he covered his eyes with one hand and laughed once under his breath. Not because it was funny, but because he had not expected to be outplayed by a waitress in orthopedic shoes. You lied. My grandmother taught me, Elena said. Feels. Never keep your diamonds in the jewelry box. That's the first place they look. He looked at her with something very close to awe. Your grandmother was terrifying. She was a baker, Elena said. She just remembered everything. That changed the plan. Feels. They could move before dawn. While Vulov's men tore apart the apartment of a woman they thought they understood, the real key could cross the city unnoticed in the shoe of that same woman. The convoy rolled out again in the dark. Halfway downtown, Feels. The first shot shattered the rear window of the lead vehicle. Glass flew like ice. Lorenzo had Elena on the floor before the sound finished. His body covered hers. Gun in one hand, voice calm in the radio. How many? 3 vehicles. Rooftop shooter. Feels. Coordinated ambush. They pushed into a market street instead of the tunnel because Lorenzo understood something Elena had been taught in a different way as a child. Order can hide you, but chaos can save you if you know how to move through it. Vendors, Feels. Tarps, crates, shouting narrow lanes. They went on foot. Elena matched his pace exactly. Stay close. Don't look up. Don't break formation. She did not panic. Fear has rhythm. So does discipline. That is what Grazia had given her. Feels. Not courage without trembling. Control while trembling. They took a private boat from a dock below Canal, crossed into Lower Manhattan in the last hour before dawn. Feels. And entered First National through a side door opened by a manager who had clearly decided not to ask questions that might shorten his career. In the vault, under fluorescent lights and old metal smell, Elena slid the key into box 404. Feels. The lock turned with a soft click that felt louder than gunfire. Inside, there was no money, no jewels. Feels. Only a leather ledger and a cassette tape labeled in small left-slanted handwriting. Her father's handwriting. She touched it the way people touch proof when they are afraid proof might vanish. Lorenzo opened the ledger first. Dates, initials, Feels. Port routes, meeting notes. Then the repeating letters. D.V. Vulov. Along the margins were the names of federal handlers, dates of contact, locations, coded confirmations. At the bottom of the final page, in English, underlined twice one sentence. Feels. He will blame the ghost when the time comes. The ghost already knows. The ghost has already prepared the answer. If you are reading this answer found you. Elena's throat tightened. He knew, Lorenzo said. He knew exactly what Vulov would do. Feels. He died 3 weeks after I was born. He knew you would exist, Lorenzo answered. That was enough. That line broke something open in her. Not tears. Something quieter and more dangerous. The understanding that love can be practical, protective. Feels. Prepared. Not all fathers get to hold their daughters. Some leave records, some leave keys, some build a road through time and trust that one day the child will find it. Feels. They took the tape to a safe house on Rector Street and found a recorder old enough to read the dead. Santino's voice came out low, careful, unmistakably hers in another register. Feels. Elena covered her mouth and listened to the father she had never heard speak explain, in calm detail, how Dmitry Vulov had traded routes and names to the FBI in exchange for prosecutorial protection and leverage over the ports. He named families, Feels. Shipments, meetings. He named the agents. He named the trap forming around himself. Then, near the end of the tape, he said, I have a family. I have a daughter who will be born in 3 months. Feels. I want the truth to outlive whatever Vulov does to the man carrying it. When the tape ended, nobody in that safe house spoke for a while. Lorenzo stared at the wall with controlled fury. Feels. Marco muttered that it was enough to bury Vulov 10 times over. Elena looked at the silent machine and understood that her life had just split in two. Before the voice. After the voice. Before that tape, she had been carrying inherited fear. After it, feels, she carried inherited purpose. That is not as glamorous as revenge. It is heavier. Revenge is hot. Purpose is cold. Purpose wants truth restored. The educational lesson buried inside every real crime story is this. Feels. Violence ruins generations, but secrecy ruins them longer. Someone always pays. Often the people who never chose the war in the first place. A child. A widow. A woman who bakes bread in exile and visits a grave under a false name for 30 years. Feels. By the time Marco's radio announced that Vulov had called an emergency dinner at the Gilded Obsidian that same evening, Elena already understood what had to happen. He knows we have the box, Lorenzo said. Or he has to assume it, Marco answered. Feels. The room went still. Lorenzo looked at Elena's uniform hanging over the back of a chair, looked at the name tag, the shoes, the face of a woman nobody saw until it was too late. He's going to the restaurant, Lorenzo said. Then so are we, Elena replied. Feels. He told her all 5 families would be there. Men who had lost shipments, years, brothers, power. Men who might not trust a Moretti accusation, but would listen to the daughter of Santino Vitale if she stood in front of them as herself and gave them evidence. Feels. They'll believe a woman with nothing to gain, Lorenzo said, before they believe me with everything to gain. Elena looked at the ledger, at the tape, at the crumbs of her old life still clinging to her uniform. Then press the uniform, she said. Feels. I'm going back in through the kitchen. Feels. They spent the next 12 hours preparing for a war that would happen under dim lighting, on polished floors, in tailored suits, while expensive wine breathed in crystal glasses. That is the thing about organized power. Feels. It rarely looks like chaos when it wins. It looks like ceremony. It looks like a dinner invitation. It looks like a room full of men pretending they have gathered for conversation, while every one of them has already counted exits, allegiances, feels, leverage, and probable casualties. Elena sat at a long table in the safe house while Marco copied the cassette to a small digital recorder, and Lorenzo mapped the dining room from memory, naming sight lines, doors, blind corners, feels, likely weapon positions, staff routes, and the narrow interval between an accusation and a bloodbath. At first, she assumed he would keep her away from most of it. Feels. Men like Lorenzo had spent their entire lives arranging women out of danger by arranging them out of decision. But that was not what he did. Feels. He put the floor plan in front of her. He asked what she remembered from working there. Which table had the clearest acoustic path, where Arthur hid panic? Which line cooks were steady under pressure? Which service door jammed in humid weather? Feels. Elena answered every question. She knew that restaurant in ways none of them could. She knew how sound traveled from the platform to the bar, which hallway cameras did not quite catch the dry storage door. Feels. When staff bunched in the pass and when they spread thin, she knew where rich men forgot to look because those were the places they believed belonged to people beneath them. That became the core of the plan. Not bigger guns, better knowledge. Feels. Respect the person who clears the plate, and sometimes that person saves your life. Ignore her, and she becomes the flaw in your entire fortress. Lorenzo listened closely, occasionally correcting, more often absorbing. Feels. And Elena recognized something she had not expected from him. Feels. He did not merely tolerate competence, he honored it. That made him dangerous in a different way. The kind of leader who notices value in overlooked people is much harder to beat than the kind who only respects money and force. Near dawn, Feels. After hours of logistics, he sat across from her with coffee and paper cups and asked the question beneath all the other questions. When this is over, what do you want? Elena did not answer immediately. It would have been easy to say safety, rest, money, Feels, distance, but the truth mattered now more than ever. I want what I always wanted, she said, just without lying about who I am. He looked at her for a long time. The Vitali estate in Palermo still exists, he said, held in trust. Feels. My father checked years ago. Elena stared at him. He looked. He never stopped. The idea struck her harder than the tape had in some ways. Feels. An old man she had feared without knowing had been carrying not only guilt for Santino's death, but also the knowledge that somewhere in New York there was a child who should have been protected and never was. Feels. Lorenzo explained that Salvatore had known about the pregnancy just before Santino died, that he had searched badly, angrily, blindly from inside a machine built for control and not for tenderness. He knew you existed, Lorenzo said. Feels. He just never found you. It was one of those truths that hurts because it is not neat. People want regret to arrive with easy villains and easy innocence. Real regret is uglier. Salvatore failed her father. He also searched for his child. Feels. Both things were true. Elena folded that into herself and let it stay complicated. A story feels real only when nobody is clean. By evening, the gilded obsidian had transformed. Private event, new table arrangement, lower lights, better wine. Feels. Cleaner sightlines, more security disguised as service. Feels. Elena came through the kitchen door at 7:22 wearing the same uniform, now pressed crisp, her hair pinned back, her face plain on purpose. Benoit, the sous chef, nearly dropped a ladle when he saw her. Elena, Arthur said, is the hard-crust bread ready? Feels. She asked. He blinked. Yes, plain olive oil, not truffle. And Benoit. She looked at him with enough force that he stopped acting confused and started paying attention. Whatever you hear tonight, keep the kitchen staff back here until it is over. Feels. He stared as if trying to reconcile the person he had worked beside for years with the person standing in front of him now. Who are you? He asked, not rudely. Honestly, Elena gave him the best answer she had. I'm the waitress. Feels. Then she took the tray and stepped onto the floor. The room began to fill. Men entered with the careful distance of rival planets sharing a sky. The Carusos first, then the Bellinis. Feels. Then the old Sicilian faction that pretended it had retired but never truly had. Salvatore arrived at 7:40 and looked exactly as Lorenzo had predicted he would. Not theatrical, not imposing, simply old, wounded, Feels. Tired in a way nobody could fake because his grief had become real again when Santino's voice came back from the dead. He sat at his table and folded his hands. That alone changed the room. Vulov arrived at 7:34, loud as ever, Feels, with the smile of a man who thought he was early to his own coronation. He occupied the center table. His men took the walls. He did not look at the staff because men like him never do. Elena moved through the room refilling water, setting bread, Feels, keeping her eyes down, counting the position of Marco's people disguised in white jackets and black aprons. One at the bar, one near the rear service door, two rotating the hallway. Lorenzo nowhere visible because visible men are easier to shoot. Feels. The first act of that dinner belonged to Vulov. Feels. He toasted vague words about stability and old respect. He complimented alliances he had betrayed. He even expressed sorrow for past misunderstandings that had damaged families over the years. Elena watched faces harden around the room. Feels. Not because they knew yet, because some men can smell rot before they know where it is buried. Then Caruso, older and slower than Vulov, but with eyes still hard, asked the question that cracked the evening open. Why did you call this dinner, Dmitri? Feels. Vulov smiled. To settle nerves, there have been rumors. The city does not need confusion. Whose confusion? Someone else asked. Before Vulov could answer, Feels, Elena stepped from the service line into the open space between the center tables carrying a tray and a small black recorder in her apron pocket. She was not supposed to speak. That was the point, Feels. Rooms like that are built on the assumption that certain people will remain silent. Feels. So when she stopped beside Vulov and said, in clear English, I think the room deserves the truth, every head turned with a violence that did not need movement. Vulov's face changed first from irritation to recognition to something darker. You, Feels. He half rose. Lorenzo appeared then from the side aisle with the kind of stillness that forced attention. He did not draw a weapon. He did not need to. Salvatore remained seated, which somehow made the moment heavier. Feels. Elena placed the tray on Vulov's table as if serving him. Bread, oil, a folded napkin. Then she looked at the room and spoke in the old dialect first, enough for the older men to hear where she stood. Feels. Enough for the younger ones to understand this was not performance. Then she switched to English. My name is Elena Vitale. My grandmother was Grazia Vitale. My father was Santino Vitale. You called him the ghost. Feels. For 20 years you believed he betrayed you. He did not. He left records. He left testimony. Feels. He left the truth for the day this room was ready to hear it. You could feel the temperature drop. Vulov laughed too quickly. A kitchen girl with a story. Elena did not look at him. She looked at the men who mattered. A kitchen girl, she said, Feels, knows exactly who gets fed and who gets ignored. My father knew the same thing about this city. Then she set the recorder on the table and pressed play. Santino's voice filled the room. It was not perfect. There was hiss on the tape, age in the sound, Feels, but no uncertainty. He named names, deliveries, federal contacts, the method, the exchange, the port routes dismantled after each leak. the people framed, the timing of his own planned scapegoating. Heels. He spoke like a man building his own witness stand because he knew no court would protect him. Around the room, men went motionless, not because they were surprised betrayal existed. Men in that world expect betrayal. Heels. They are wounded not by its existence, but by its scale, by its patience. Heels. By how long they sat beside it without knowing. Elena watched Caruso's expression change first, then Bellini's. Then one of the old Sicilians closed his eyes at the mention of a nephew who had gone away for 10 years after a route had been compromised. Heels. This is where the human lesson of the story sharpened. Evil is rarely theatrical in real life. More often it is administrative. A signature, a meeting, a transfer. A lie maintained long enough that widows become old women and children inherit silence. Heels. Santino's tape was devastating not because it shouted, but because it accounted. That is what truth does when it is documented. It strips glamour off power and reveals paperwork, choices, names, dates, harm. By the time the recording ended, Heels, nobody in the room was pretending anymore. Caruso asked the first clear question. Is that your name on the informant document? He did not speak loudly. He did not need to. Heels. Vulov looked around and finally understood that the room he thought he controlled had turned against him one listening face at a time. It was business, he said. There it was. The ugliest sentence in half the crimes of history. It was business. Heels. As if profit erases the human cost. As if children grow up fine with dead fathers because someone made a strategic calculation. Elena felt something settle inside her then. A peace colder than rage. Heels. The sort that comes when your enemy finally names himself correctly. Not a mastermind, not a rival, not a legend. Just a man who called ruin business. Salvatore stood up and came to the center with his cane clicking on marble. Heels. He picked up a steak knife from a nearby table and offered it to Elena. For Santino, he said. Your blood, your justice. The room held its breath. Even Vulov looked uncertain. This was the ending everyone expected. A blade, a daughter. Heels. A public balancing of the scale. Elena took the knife. Everyone watched her. Heels. Then she drove it straight down into the mahogany table with all the force in her arm. The blade stuck quivering between bread plates and crystal. The sound cut through the room. I am not a butcher, she said. I am a Vital. We do not kill rats. Heels. We expose them. Then we walk away from the filth. She looked around the room slowly. He is yours. Do what your honor requires. Then she turned her back on Vulov. That mattered more than the accusation. She denied him the importance of her eyes. Heels. Behind her, the room erupted into controlled violence as the families converged not in chaos, but in decision. Lorenzo reached her before she reached him. His arms closed around her fully, not for display, not romantic yet, just human and total. Heels. She let herself lean once. Just once. It's done, he murmured. Not yet, she answered, staring past his shoulder at Salvatore. There's still something I have to do. Heels. At dawn, they drove to Queens. Not as a convoy now, not as a show force, just one car and the right number of witnesses. Heels. Elena sat in the back with Salvatore while Lorenzo drove and Marco stayed quiet in the front because some journeys are not about security. They are about allowing grief to arrive in the right shape. The cemetery was modest. East section. Row 7. Heels. Plot 114. The stone read Giovanni Ferraro, 1948-1985. A false name. A true inscription. Grazia had buried Santino under borrowed words, but she had hidden him with respect. Heels. Salvatore stood before the marker with both hands resting on his cane and looked older than he had looked at any point in the restaurant. Older than he had looked in his own house, older even than he had looked when he heard the tape. Heels. Because power can survive many things. What it survives least well is the moment it realizes it failed love. Elena gave him silence. Heels. Her grandmother had taught her that silence at a grave is not absence. It is courtesy. It is how you let the living speak to the dead without interruption. Finally, Salvatore said, Santino, just the name, nothing else for a while. Then, Heels, I buried you in anger because anger was easier than shame. That is not an excuse. It is only the truth. His voice shook once and steadied. You should have had a proper stone. Your daughter should have had a name she could speak without fear. Heels. Grazia should not have carried this alone. Elena listened and did not rescue him from any of it. That is another human lesson many people learn late. Not every apology needs to be softened for the comfort of the person giving it. Heels. Some apologies need to stand there in the cold and feel their own weight. Salvatore set a small round loaf of bread at the foot of the stone. Real bread. Maria had baked it that morning from a recipe Elena reconstructed from memory on the drive. Peels, rosemary in the crust. Peels, olive oil brushed on top. For the road, the old man said softly. Then he removed his hat. Lorenzo stood behind him, hands in his coat pocket, saying nothing, and Elena looked at him with new understanding. She had seen his control, his strategy, Peels, his restraint under fire. Here she saw the cost of having a father built equally out of loyalty and damage. Sons in families like that inherit both the empire and the unresolved grief. By the time the sun had risen properly, Peels, something irreversible had happened among the graves. Santino Vitale had been spoken to as a friend again, not a traitor, not a ghost used to explain away old failure. A friend, a father. A man failed by the machine he served. They left in silence. Peels. Back at the estate, the formal consequences were already moving. Belov was gone. Nobody explained where. Nobody needed to. His ports were being redistributed. His accounts frozen by men who never appeared in newspapers. Peels. Calls from all 5 families had gone out before dawn confirming what the tape had established. Santino's name was restored. Quietly, thoroughly, the way serious corrections happen. Elena expected to feel triumph. She did not. She felt tired. Peels. Empty in some places, newly solid in others. Truth is not a fireworks show when it lands. It is often a cleanup operation. You still have to decide what to do with the rest of your life after the enemy is gone. Peels. That afternoon, she sat at a long kitchen table in the East Wing with Maria, who had somehow already learned all the important details without anybody telling her directly. Peels, and sorted through the recipes Grazia had left in a notebook full of margins and corrections and flour marks. Lorenzo found her there reading a page for fennel bread and stopped in the doorway. Everyone is asking what happens next, he said. Peels. And what do they think? Elena asked without looking up. Some think you should stay under our protection. Peels. Some think the Vitali name gives you standing now. Some think the Sicilian estate should revert to you immediately. My father thinks he owes you more than land. And what do you think? Lorenzo pulled out the chair opposite her and sat. Peels. For once he looked like he had not prepared his answer in advance. I think choice matters, more than anyone in our world likes to admit. Elena closed the notebook. Good. He rested his forearms on the table. What do you choose? Peels. She looked around the kitchen. At Maria kneading dough in silence. At the windows. At the expensive stone counters. At the ocean beyond them that had no opinion about men with guns and old vendettas. Then she answered honestly. Peels. I choose not to become what hurt my family. Lorenzo did not move. Meaning? Meaning I will not spend the rest of my life orbiting revenge and calling it legacy. My father died collecting truth. My grandmother lived preserving dignity. Peels. If I turn that into a throne, then I have learned the wrong lesson. That landed between them with more force than if she had shouted. He nodded slowly. That sounds like Santino. I never knew him. You know his best parts. Peels. She considered that and felt unexpectedly sad. Not crushingly, gently, the kind of sadness that lives beside gratitude. I want the estate in Palermo, she said at last. Not for power, for beginning again. I want to restore the bakery. Maybe teach. Peels. Maybe hire women who need honest work. Maybe make the place my grandmother deserved at the end of her life. Lorenzo smiled in that rare, unguarded way that changed his whole face. A bakery, he said. You keep making that sound like a joke. It isn't, Peels. It's just. He searched for the word. Radical. Elena laughed once softly. In our world, yes. Feeding people without humiliating them. Building something that does not depend on fear. Calling that success instead of conquest. Peels. That is more radical than anything we did last night. That line stayed with her. Because he was right. Decency gets remembered, and rebuilding is harder. Over the next days, she met the practical version of grief. Lawyers, deeds, Peels. Swiss account disclosures tied to Santino's contingency plans, the release of certain documents, quiet visits from old men who had known her father and looked at her as if apology could cross time if spoken gently enough. She accepted some, Peels, refused some. No longer invisible, she had to learn a new discipline. Boundaries, fame in criminal circles is only another kind of threat. She told Salvatore she would not be used as a symbol at gatherings or leveraged in negotiations. Peels. He agreed immediately. That told her as much as any apology could. Respect is often clearest in what a powerful person chooses not to take once they could. A week later, they traveled to Palermo. Peels. The Vitali estate sat outside the city, half abandoned but structurally sound. A stone house with a collapsed side roof, olive trees in stubborn rows, and the ruined shell of what had once been a village bakery attached to the main courtyard. Feels. Elena stood in the doorway where her grandmother had once stood as a girl, and let the smell of dust, citrus, and old stone fill her lungs. Salvatore had not come. This was deliberate. Some beginnings should not arrive under the weight of old debts. Feels. Lorenzo did. Not as chaperone, not as owner, just as the man who had helped her survive long enough to choose. They walked the property in the late afternoon heat. He pointed out irrigation channels, legal boundaries, structural issues, feels. All the practical things he knew because he was the sort of person who translated emotion into logistics when emotions got too large. Finally, they reached the old baking room with its cracked oven mouth and soot-blackened walls. "It can be restored, feels," he said. Feels. Elena touched the stone. "Everything can," she answered, then smiled. "Not easily. Nothing worth keeping is easy." They stood close in the cooling light. No rush, no grand declaration. Feels. People raised around danger know the value of moving slowly when something good appears. He asked if she wanted security. She said yes, but discreet. He asked if she wanted investors. She said no. Feels. He asked if she wanted a sign over the door with the Vitali name. Elena thought about it, then nodded. Yes, but not because of the families. Why then? Because hidden names poison people. "I'm done with hidden names." Feels. He looked at her, and there it was again, that mixture of admiration and something softer, something neither of them trusted yet enough to name. "Done," he said. In the months that followed, Elena learned how restoration works. Not in the cinematic sense. Feels. Not with montage music and one dramatic reveal. Feels. Real restoration is invoices, permits, plaster dust, arguments over tile, local labor, burned fingers, recipes tested 6 times because memory is imprecise, and flour behaves differently in different air. It is also listening. Feels. The women she hired were not romantic symbols. They were widows, migrants, divorced mothers, a girl from Catania who had left a violent boyfriend. Feels. An older accountant, tired of being patronized by men who assumed she was only good at making coffee during meetings. Elena built the place around one rule her grandmother had lived by, and the restaurant had violated every night. Feels. No one working here gets treated like they are less human because they are serving someone. That rule changed everything. Staff ate first on long days. Tips were transparent. Hours were sane. People used each other's names. Feels. Bread was not plated to perform luxury. It was made to be eaten warm. At the opening, the line stretched beyond the courtyard. Feels. Locals came because they were curious. Journalists came because old bloodlines make lazy headlines. Elena refused interviews for a while. When she finally gave one, she did not speak about gangs, betrayals, or famous men. She spoke about labor. Feels. About respect. About how often society trains people to overlook the human beings who cook, clean, carry, pour, translate, and hold communities together. "My family lost generations to secrecy and power," she said. Feels. "I wanted to build something where people could walk in hungry and leave with more dignity than they came with." That quote traveled farther than she expected. Schools invited her to speak. Women wrote letters. Feels. Former restaurant workers sent messages describing all the tiny humiliations of being treated as invisible and how strange it felt to see someone tell a public story in which the waitress was not decoration, not casualty, not the body on the floor. Feels, but the keeper of memory and the maker of justice. Feels. Lorenzo came and went through those first months, never overstaying, never pretending he did not still belong to a world Elena had chosen not to join, but he helped in the ways that mattered. Licenses expedited. Feels. Predatory lenders discouraged from approaching. A supply chain problem solved with 2 phone calls and a raised eyebrow that suggested someone somewhere had made a very poor business decision. They learned each other slowly. The healthy way. Feels. Through weather and work and disagreement. He liked structure. She liked room to improvise. He made lists. She remembered everything without writing it down. He trusted outcomes. She trusted process. He believed problems should be moved toward. Feels. She believed some should be allowed to cool before touching. They argued about oven placement and event policy, and whether the courtyard needed more shade. The arguments were good because neither of them needed to win all of them. Feels. That is another kind of healing rarely celebrated enough. Feels. Not dramatic love, safe love, respectful love, the kind that does not require you to shrink to keep it. One evening, almost a year after the night at the restaurant, Elena stayed late in the bakery after everyone left. The ovens were off. Feels. The room held residual warmth. She stood alone behind the counter and looked at the sign above the door reflected backward in the glass. Vitale Pana Cafe. Outside, the lights of the small town were beginning to glow. Heels. She heard footsteps and knew without turning who it was. Lorenzo. He came in carrying no crisis, no guards, no agenda except a bottle of wine and a paper packet of sea salt caramel from a shop in town she loved but always forgot to visit before it closed. Heels. Bribery, she said. I prefer to think of it as strategic generosity. He leaned against the counter. How was today? She could have given the easy answer. Busy. Good. Fine. Instead, she told the truth. Heels. One of the new girls cried because a customer thanked her for bringing water. Heels. She said nobody had ever thanked her in any job before. Lorenzo was quiet. That says ugly things about the world. It says ordinary disrespect gets normalized so deeply that simple courtesy feels like rescue. He nodded and looked around the room. Heels. And this place changes that? Elena smiled, tired and proud. Maybe enough. He watched her for a long moment, then said, You know what your father would think? Tell me. He'd think you won. Elena laughed softly and shook her head. Heels. By opening a bakery? No. By refusing to let pain choose your shape. That line stayed. Maybe because it was true. Maybe because winning in the stories most people get told looks like domination, a body on the floor, a throne inherited. Heels. A city conquered. But real winning can look smaller and better. A grave finally visited under the right name. Staff greeted with respect. Women paid fairly. Bread cooling on racks while sunlight moves across stone. Heels. A daughter who was supposed to become a weapon deciding instead to become a builder. The old world still existed, of course. Men still met in private rooms. Fear still changed hands in envelopes. Heels. Salvatore still ruled what remained of his sphere with age and quieter judgment. But even he changed. Sometimes he came to the bakery alone, without announcement, and sat in the corner with coffee and warm bread, watching people talk. Heels. Children reach for pastries. Workers laugh after long shifts. He tipped too much and left before anyone could thank him properly. Once, as he stood to go, he told Elena, Your grandmother was right. Bread tells the truth about a house. Heels. Elena asked him what truth this house told. The old man looked around, then back at her. That power without respect is hunger with better furniture. Then he left. Years later, Heels. People would still tell the story of the waitress who walked into a room of mafia bosses and brought down a traitor with bread, memory, and evidence. Heels. That is the part legends keep because it is cinematic. But the truer ending was quieter. The truer ending was this. She kept the uniform folded in a drawer. She kept the name tag with her grandmother's handwriting. Heels. She did not forget what invisibility felt like. She made sure no one in her bakery ever had to. Heels. She visited Santino's grave every year and eventually replaced the stone with one bearing his real name after the legal dust settled and the dead could safely belong to themselves again. Heels. Salvatore stood beside her for that unveiling with tears he no longer hid. Lorenzo held her hand in public for the first time that day, not because there were cameras or witnesses who mattered, Heels, but because grief had become memory and memory had become peace. And whenever young people asked Elena what she learned from the whole thing, she never gave them the answer they expected. She did not say be ruthless. She did not say hide your weakness. Heels. She did not say power is everything. Heels. She said, pay attention to the people the room ignores. They usually know where the truth is buried, and never let anyone convince you that being decent makes you small. In the end, decency is what rebuilds what violence breaks. Heels. That was the real inheritance. Not the land, not the money, not the old names spoken with fear. The inheritance was a way of moving through the world without becoming cruel, just because cruelty had once been done to you. That is harder than revenge. Heels. It is also rarer, and because it is rare, it matters more.